Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we have an exciting episode for you all about negotiation. So, what we're going to dive into today are 11 negotiation strategies that you can use in order to close deals. Now, some of these you may have heard before, some of them will probably be new. And on top of that, before we even get into them, it's very important that we cover one of the biggest topics when it comes to negotiation. So let's dive into that, and then we'll get into the 11 different strategies that you can use, regardless if you're helping buyers, sellers, or even potentially negotiating when you are sitting down for a listing presentation. So first off, what is this concept around negotiation that we all need to have a firm understanding of? Well, it is the relationship between power and need. And it works like this. If you have a higher need, you will have lower power. And if you have a lower need, you're going to have higher power. So basically, what this is stating is if you are willing to walk away, you have more power in the negotiation. This is an extremely important concept for us all to understand because when we are advising sellers and buyers, let's say that we're working with a buyer, and let's say that there is a listing on the market right now, vacant, and they have already sold their home and they need to move into this one in 30 days. There's no other inventory on the market. Well, in this case, this buyer that we're helping actually has a very high need. There's no other properties on the market currently, and they have to close within a month. So they're going to have less power because their need is higher. So this concept is important for us to wrap our heads around because if I'm representing the seller and this is information that we have, well, this is information that can help our seller ultimately. And if I'm representing the buyer and this is information that I have, we want to be very cautious about what we are bringing forth to the listing side. So now that we have an understanding of power and need, let's jump into the 11 strategies that you can use. Strategy number 1, the winner's curse. So the winner's curse, it is a very common occurrence when a buyer puts in an offer and the offer is accepted without a counter. So what's going on here in a buyer's mind when they submit an offer and that offer is accepted as is? Well, they're thinking we should have offered less because there was no counter. So they feel like they could have got it for less. So they win, they're happy, and actually this happens in multiple offers too. They're happy because they have the house, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking, could we have got it for less? So how do we actually work through this? Well, if we are representing a seller, if an offer comes in and they are very happy with it, this is a strategy that we want to explore. Is it something that we want to do? Do we want to come back to them with a counter? Which actually, in many ways, if they're satisfied with the offer and you counter and they say no to that counter, well, they're still satisfied with the offer. And if they say yes, well, potentially you're getting a higher price. So it tends to be in almost all cases, a win-win. It's a little different when a buyer's agent submits an offer and says it's firm, it's not open for negotiation. But if it does come in, it is open for negotiation. Actually countering helps the buyer feel more confident in their decision because they don't feel this curse, this winner's curse, because they realize that, hey, I put in a good offer, but we still had to negotiate back and forth in order to get to a result. Next, we have the aggressive negotiator. So aggressive negotiation tactics, they tend to actually not work very well at all in most negotiation circumstances, but especially in real estate. The reason for that is oftentimes when we are negotiating with an agent on the other side, we're on the same team. We're truly on the same team trying to put this deal together. But we've all encountered, and if you haven't, you'll definitely encounter these aggressive negotiators, these ones that are a little bit more hard hitting. They may even be a little bit confrontational. So how do we handle these folks? Well, all we need to do is respond in kind. And what do we mean by this? If somebody is aggressive or confrontational with me, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive with my approach. That's not saying I'm going to match them. And it's not saying I'm going to go down a dirty road if I'm not getting along with this agent, not by any means. Instead, what you're going to do here is you're just going to be slightly more aggressive. You're going to actually be communicating this in slightly more of a confrontational approach. Now, you do not want to be confrontational. And in fact, sometimes these agents, you can just kill them with kindness and it works better than anything. But if that's not working, we have to think about how we can respond in kind. Now, this also works for the agent who's bringing us an offer and who's extremely personable, who's really fun to work with, who's asking a lot of questions. We don't want to be aggressive. We don't want to actually be pushing these people too hard because we're not responding in kind. So this actually works regardless of the negotiation. But that being said, If they're being more aggressive and more confrontational, we just have to increase that slightly within ourselves. Next, we have the red herring. Now, the red herring, we may be familiar with this concept, but basically what this is we are negotiating on something that's extremely important to us. So let's say price. However, we're also working in other things. Maybe we're working in conditions and possession, and we're also negotiating on those. Now, if I'm representing a seller, maybe they're happy with the conditions and they're happy with the possession. They're not happy with the price. So we're negotiating on all three of these things. And what we're doing by negotiating on these two items that are not really that much of a concern for the seller is at the end, if we're a few grand apart, maybe we change our possession back to suit the buyer best, change our conditions back to suit the buyer best, and then we end up getting the higher price. So we're using something that is less of a concern for the seller in order to get what's most important to them done. Now, there is a caution when it comes to red herrings, and it's if you are countering. So let's say that the possession that the buyer provides us is actually perfect. And then we counter with a possession that's a little bit less perfect for us as a seller. We have to be comfortable with the fact that the buyer may say, oh, great, that day's perfect. So we need to be comfortable with our counters. We can't just use it in thinking that we'll always be able to revert back to the original possession. However, this is a strategy that can work extremely well in order to take the emphasis away from what's most important and then come back to it in order to get the result that we're looking for. The next strategy is called the victory illusion. Now, this works very similar to the red herring. However, what we're doing here is we always want the other party to feel like they're winning. Okay, so regardless of the negotiation, if I'm representing the seller or if I'm even representing the buyer, I want the listing agent or buyer's agent to actually think that they are winning. I want them to feel like they're winning. So how can we actually do this? Well, if we are at a stalemate, and these work very, very well when we're at a stalemate. So we are between, let's say, a few grand apart and we just can't close that gap. Well, is there anything else that we can do in order to sweeten the deal? Oftentimes, if it's a seller, maybe you're putting in some furniture. Maybe you're changing some inclusions, something along those lines. If you're a buyer, maybe you're asking for more inclusions. So when it comes to this strategy, really, when we are at a stalemate, oftentimes sellers, they just don't want to budge. They're at their limit. They just don't want to budge. Buyers, they're at their top point. They don't want to budge either. They don't want to be the first one to have to actually come up or come down. So what we do here is if we are representing the seller, maybe we're getting the price we want, but then we're sacrificing a few things when it comes to inclusions. So both parties feel like they're winning, and especially the other side, the side that you are not representing. We want them to feel like they are always winning. And that is what really brings these deals together. The next strategy is called the dichotomy of time. Now, this concept, it really is important for us to understand when we're both on the listing and buying side. And it works like this. Typically, the longer the negotiations are drawn out, the less likely the buyer will proceed. And typically, the longer the negotiations are drawn out, the more likely a seller will proceed. And this is especially true when we're in softening markets. So let's explain this a little bit further. So first off, on the buying side, the longer things get drawn out, if we make the buyer wait, so for example, if we're representing a seller and the seller says, well, let's just wait a couple days and see if something better comes in. Well, we know we're very likely going to lose that buyer. They're going to lose interest. Their interest is highest when the offer is submitted. And then the longer that we draw this out on the selling side, the lower likelihood in most cases that the buyer will actually continue with the property. And that's because as things draw on, they're going to start to become more frustrated. They're going to be looking at more properties. They're going to be booking more showings. So we have to be very cautious of this when we are representing a seller. Now, on the opposing side, when we are representing a buyer, usually the seller, the longer they think about the offer, the more they think, maybe this is something that we want to proceed with. Now, if I'm representing a buyer, and let's say we're not able to come to an agreement, and let's say the property's been on the market for a while, so this doesn't necessarily work if it's a brand new property on the market, but if it's been on the market for a while, typically the longer the seller thinks about the offer in front of them, the more compelling it becomes. And so I want to prepare my buyer to keep their excitement level high, even if this negotiation continues on for a few days. Because as that time progresses, there's a higher likelihood that seller is going to soften and think, hey, maybe this is an offer that we want to work with. Again, it depends on the property. If it's new on the market, that's not necessarily the case at all. But if it's on the market for 60, 90 days, the longer the seller thinks about it, the more they start to think, this is something I should take. So this is why it's the dichotomy of time. Because if you're representing the buyer, they want to move quick. If you're representing the seller, oftentimes they want to move slower. So we need to keep this concept in mind. Next, we have the danger of the line in the sand. Now, This really comes down to human psychology. If we are asking our seller, what's the lowest price you'd take, or we're asking our buyer, what's the highest you'd pay for this property, what we're doing here is we are drawing artificial lines in the sand. And the issue with this is people don't want to come back on their word. So if the buyer says, hey, I'm not willing to spend over 700,000, then even if we get to 702, they're probably not going to want to proceed because they're coming against their word. They're going against what they had said previously. And same goes for sellers. So, what does this mean for us? It means we really want to take the conversation away from lines in the sand. We don't want to know what's the buyer's max and what's the seller's minimum. Now, there are times where we're going to get into that, but generally speaking, especially off the start, we do not want to be drawing lines in the sand. And really, this is helping our client. Because it's not just saying that this is a max that you're going to go, it's helping them understand, it's helping them think through the process of, hey, potentially it makes sense to go slightly above where we would be because this is the right home for us. And same goes for the seller. So this concept is an important one to keep in mind, especially when we are advising and we are talking with our own client. We want to avoid lines in the sand. Same goes for setting listing prices. We want to avoid lines in the sand, and instead we want to talk more about what's going on in the market, and we want to talk more about what their needs are. That is what's most important, is what their needs are given the circumstances. Next, we have the upcoming event. Now, the upcoming event is all about creating urgency. And this works very, very well, both on the buying and selling side, but especially on the selling side. And an upcoming event could be something like an open house. So let's say listing comes to the market, buyer agent comes through your listing, buyer provides some great feedback, they're interested, but they're just not ready to write an offer at this point in time. All you have to say to the buyer's agent is, with the upcoming open house, would you like me to keep you posted about any incoming offers? So what we're doing here is we are basically hinting that we're expecting offers. We're expecting to see offers. Now, the same goes if you're representing a seller. Maybe it's not an open house. Maybe the next day you have full day of showings. So you can let the buyer's agent know that we got a full day of showings tomorrow. Would you like me to keep you posted if we do receive any offers? And what this is, of course, going to do, it's going to make them second guess the concept of waiting. We are creating urgency using an upcoming event. On the buying side, you can do this as well. Traditionally, though, this works a lot better when the offer is submitted, and then maybe, let's say it's a Friday, and the buyer is going to go out and look at more places on a Saturday. So what you're doing to the selling side by representing the buyer is you're saying, hey, we got a full day of showings booked tomorrow. We'll cancel those if we're able to get this offer accepted tonight. However, if not, we'll go through our showings, then let's chat tomorrow. So we are creating urgency. We are creating urgency by an upcoming event. It works very, very well. The next strategy is optionality, or this or that. So what we're doing here is we're providing two counters. So if we're representing a seller and we're talking to the buyer, maybe we have one price with one possession and we have another price with a different possession. So this sort of concept can work really well because what you're doing is you are providing agency. You're giving an opportunity for the buyer or the opposing side to actually make a selection. And when they have agency in what they choose, they feel a lot more drawn and they feel a lot more connected to the decision they're going to make. So what we really need to think about here is, what are the circumstances that will make sense for our seller or our buyer? And there are times where it may not make sense. So at times, there is no price difference between possession for a seller, which is fine. But can we provide optionality? Can we provide more than one counter potentially? And of course, we have to be aware of our rules and our guidelines within our jurisdictions and how we actually communicate counteroffers and if they're written or if they're verbal. But that being said, if we're able to provide some level of optionality to the other side, they feel like they have agency and they feel a lot more connected to the deal. It works very well. Now, the last strategy is asking the unanswerable. Asking the unanswerable is a very effective strategy for helping people put themselves in your shoes. So let's say that I'm representing a seller. Buyer brings us an offer. They want to close in 3 weeks. My seller has kids, a full house. And so what I'm doing here is I would come back to the buyer's agent and I would say, look, they have kids, they have a full house, they'll have to move out. How are we supposed to close in 3 weeks? And then you pause. And the pause is key here. We want to ask a question that is hard for them to answer and pause. Because what this is now doing is they're thinking, okay, now let's put myself in that seller's shoes and think, hey, is this actually possible? Chris Voss actually explains this very, very well. His line is, how are we supposed to do that? So when you are in a situation and you're not getting anywhere or an offer comes in, it's just not working, you can ask that question. And there's a variety of different ways that you can approach it. But how are we supposed to do that? Creates what Chris Voss calls forced empathy. And again, that's putting the other side in your side's shoes. We're creating empathy so that they're able to see what it's like to actually be that opposing side. And this is what we call ask the unanswerable. So think through the question in your mind that you can ask that will force that other person to put themselves in your seller or your buyer's shoes. Now for the final strategy. This strategy works extremely well in slower buyers markets, and it's the reverse offer. So the way the reverse offer works is like this. You, as a selling agent and as a seller potentially, are providing an offer to a buyer. So let's say you're listed at 700. Buyer comes through, feedback is, we love the home, we think the price is a little bit too high. You then, as a listing agent, talk to your seller, again, being mindful of rules and regulations and ensuring that you are having this conversation with your seller. But potentially the seller says, well, I would take 690. So then you go back to the buyer's agent and you say, I understand 700 doesn't work. How does 690 sound? And so what you're doing here is you, the seller, in a sense, are providing an offer to the buyer. So you wouldn't buy it at 700, would you buy it at 690? This strategy, especially in slower markets, can work extremely well because exactly what's going to happen here, the buyer's agent's going to go back to the buyer. They're going to feel like they have more information. And then from there, they're going to take that to the buyer and the buyer is going to say, wow, this is some information that I have that maybe other buyers don't have. And it can stimulate an offer quite quickly. So those are your 11 negotiation strategies. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out anytime at revrealestateschool.com or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.